which means that I have a doctoral degree. And in my case, I have a PhD. It means that I went to school for like way too long. I actually went to school for like 6 years after college, but it was worth it. I'm really glad that I did it. But if you want to become a clinical psychologist, that means you do have to get a doctoral degree, either getting a PhD, which is what I had, or a PsyD, which is a little bit more kind of clinically oriented. A PhD is more research oriented. But if you're like, that doctoral lifestyle is not for me, there's a lot of other ways that you can become a therapist if that's what you want to do. So happy to talk about that more. But the reason why I wanted to become a clinical psychologist is because clinical psychologists wear many hats. And I was really excited about all the things that a clinical psychologist can do. So I mentioned I do research. We're going to be talking about my research today. Um, and I also do therapy. I'm a licensed therapist. Have a lot of therapy training. We also do assessments, which is kind of a unique thing that clinical psychologists do. So if you have a question about whether or not you meet criteria for a disorder or need to be evaluated if you have a disorder to make sure that you can do certain things or get access to certain resources or accommodations. That's something a psychologist does. We teach as well. And then we also do consulting. So sometimes, companies or organizations will bring me in and ask, for my feedback on certain things. And then we also work for nonprofits as well, just kind of helping them to either incorporate mental health or target mental health or things like that. So we can do a lot of things as clinical psychologists. I love the career path that I've chosen, and I'm happy to talk more about that with people if they have questions. For right now, I am a faculty at Rutgers University. I actually teach in our PsyD program here. It's called the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. So even though I have a PhD, I teach people who want to get a PsyD and are more kind of clinically oriented, and I also do research. But what's cool about being a clinical psychologist is I can, take off my teaching hat and put on my assessment hat, take on my assessment hat and put on my consultation hat. So there's a lot of things that I can do. So I also we already kind of did an icebreaker, but just acknowledging that we're going to talk about something that can be a little tough to hear sometimes. I wanted to just take a moment of mindfulness just for us to kind of check in and see where we're at. As a therapist, I can't help myself sometimes. I need to include mindfulness as much as I can. So we're going to do just a really, really quick mindfulness practice. And the point of mindfulness is really to observe and notice what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our minds, without judgment. We're just going to kind of notice without saying, oh, that's bad or that's good. We're just going to kind of notice. So if you're comfortable, please close your eyes. If you're not comfortable closing your eyes, you can just look at something kind of in the middle distance, like your keyboard or something on your desk or on your bed. I'm going to close my eyes and just take a deep breath. I like to do in through my nose and out through my mouth. And I just want you to notice maybe, you came in today to this presentation, maybe feeling a little harried, maybe you were late, or maybe you slept in, and just notice how you're feeling. Maybe go from the top of your head down to your feet and kind of check in with your body and notice, are your shoulders tight? How do your legs feel? How does your stomach feel? Do you need to get a snack in a minute? And check in with your feelings as well. How are you feeling right now? Are you feeling happy? Are you tired? Are you anxious? Just kind of maybe let a word come up to describe how you're feeling, or maybe a couple words, or if you don't have a word, just an idea or a picture of how you're feeling. And we'll take another deep breath and open your eyes if you closed your eyes. And welcome back. So thank you for doing that with me. I always like to kind of center ourselves before we talk about something as tough as suicide. And I want to, just make space and acknowledge that, I research suicide. I'm really used to talking about suicide. And yet I know that talking about suicide can be really tough because a lot of people's lives have been touched by suicide. Whether that's, something that you've struggled with or a loved one has struggled with, it's incredibly prevalent and not something that we talk about very often. So, on one hand, it's kind of exciting to be able to talk openly about something that's kind of taboo, and also it might bring up a lot of feelings. So, if you find at any point that this talk is just making it kind of difficult for you to engage without feeling overwhelmed, I just want you to take care of yourself first. So here are some techniques for you to use if you notice that you are getting overwhelmed. One of my favorites is called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique, which a lot of you have probably heard about. But if you haven't, you really just kind of identify 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And it kind of brings you out of your mind and back into, the present moment. Um, and also you can like switch up the senses if one of them isn't working for you. There's also 4-7-8 breathing, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe out for 8. You can do that a couple times, and that will actually bring your anxiety down. And if those numbers don't work for you, if you're having trouble holding for 7, hold for less. That's fine. The important thing is that you breathe out longer than you breathe in. And as we were all talking about our comfort items that we would bring with us on our desert island, you can also feel free to grab that item if you're feeling overwhelmed. So just wanted to give you some of those in case you are finding it difficult to engage with the presentation today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we're going to do our presentation today. I don't know how I usually kind of do things, but I like to interact even if it's a Zoom presentation. So feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have questions. I will try to monitor the chat, but again, Zoom is not letting me live my best life today. So if I miss your question in the chat, I will pause a couple of times for like bigger questions and use that as an opportunity to catch what's going on in the chat. But also feel free to, unmute and interrupt me if you have any questions. And again, we'll pause for any kind of bigger questions or if you feel weird about interrupting. And we're also going to have a couple of small group discussions because nobody wants to hear me talk for 2 hours. That's not fun for anybody. So we'll do that as well. And Lynette, do we usually like take a break in the middle? Do people usually take a break?
Yeah, we can definitely take a break in the middle
Okay,
too.
cool. Yeah. So we can maybe have like a little break in the middle. Okay, cool. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, a lot of what I do is research. And my lab is called the City Lab, the Context and Identity and the Treatment of Youth Lab at Rutgers. Isaac is actually a member of my lab. Shout out to Isaac here at Rutgers. And in our lab, we really focus on 3 things, but they all kind of, revolve around each other. So we're often, researching multiple things at the same time. So I research suicide, especially among youth of color and other marginalized identities. And I also research something called treatment engagement, which is how youth really think about treatment, either attending treatment or their thoughts about treatment, just kind of ways that they could engage with mental health treatment. And I also look at cultural and contextual factors. So things like discrimination or cultural values and how that impacts mental health and also treatment. And really my goal in my research is to make sure that the tools that we have to work with teens who are at risk for suicide are relevant to all teens, regardless of their background and if they hold a marginalized identity, with a specific focus on teens of color. And you might be wondering why focus on teens of color? Well, first of all, across race and across ethnicity, suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth and young adults. So it's a major issue. And, suicide is a major issue for all youth, but it's a particularly concerning issue among youth of color. So I wanted to put up some graphs here from, national data. So this first one is the line graph on the left, right here. You can see the blue line at the top is non-Hispanic white youth over time. And this is going all the way back to 2000. Some of you weren't even alive at that point. I was. It was a great year. But you can see that, for non-Hispanic white youth, that suicide rates were going up, but around like 2016, 2017, it started to go down. Which is great because, around, the early aughts, there was really a major concern about suicide among youth. And there were a lot of interventions that were put in place by public health people, by, therapists to really intervene on suicide. So it was a major issue. We were really working on it, and it worked for white youth, that we see the suicide rates were starting to go down. Um, but if you look at the other lines, the green lines, you can see we have Hispanic and then non-Hispanic Black youth. Those lines, even though they were lower to begin with, they started to go up, which is really concerning because it means that the interventions that we've put a lot of time and a lot of effort into don't seem to be working for youth of color. So that means that we need to be trying something different. We need to put a little bit more focus on that. And then if you look over on the right, I have some bar graphs, which is just kind of overall trends in youth suicide rates over 10 years from 2010 to 2020. And we did see increases across the board when we look at that kind of 10-year time span. But if you look, and it's broken down by race and ethnicity, that we see some major increases when we're looking at youth of color. So for American Indian and Alaskan Native youth, they already had really, really high suicide rates. And that's kind of a common thing that we find in the research is that this group tends to have really, really high suicide rates, but they went up. But not as much as the other ones. So for Asian American Pacific Islander, it went up by 51.9%. For Black youth, it went up by almost 90%. And then for white youth, it went up by 33%. So suicide is always a concern, right? It's always a concern among youth. But when we look at youth of color, we're especially concerned because the rates are really going up. So that's why I focus on youth of color. And I also wanted to just kind of establish some common terms that I'm going to be using a lot today. So suicide is the act of killing oneself with the intention of ending one's life. So it's really about intention. It's actually kind of hard sometimes to establish that intentionality, but there's also the fact that like a lot of people do die, by their own hand, but it's like an accident. So when we're talking about suicide, we're talking about that intention to end one's life. I'll also be talking a lot about suicidal thoughts, or sometimes you'll hear the words suicide ideation. And these are just thoughts that people have about killing oneself. And there's actually a lot of variation about suicidal thoughts, right? So some people will have what we would call more passive suicidal thoughts, which would be thoughts like, I wish I wasn't around anymore, or this is really hard and I don't want to do it anymore, to more active thoughts of suicide, which is, thoughts about method and plans and things like that. So we take it all very seriously, but there is some kind of variation in suicidal thoughts. And then there's suicide attempts, which are any actions that are done with the intention of ending one's life. And so, one thing that I see a lot as a clinician who focuses on suicide is that, parents will come and say, look, yeah, my youth, did something kind of minor, but they said it was with the intention of ending their life. And so, like, I don't really know what to do with that. And so I'll always say, even if it was like a minor, non-lethal action that they did, especially with like younger kids, you'll see that they'll do something that's not necessarily lethal. But what we really care about is that intentionality, that somebody did something with the intention of ending their life, and that's really concerning. And then finally, something that comes up a lot in practice when you're working with suicide is what we call non-suicide self-injury, or you might have heard it called self-harm, which is an action that is done with the intention of hurting oneself, but without the intention of dying. So sometimes you'll hear about people who might be cutting, scratching, burning themselves, and they don't want to die, but they're in pain or something like that, and they're engaging in this action in order to hurt themselves. So that's not suicide, but it is really concerning. And so we do kind of think about that when we talk about suicide. So those are just some kind of common terms that you might be hearing me use today. I wanted to make sure you knew what they were. Any questions so far about terms? Oh, I see that there might be some things in the chat. Okay, cool. Awesome. I found the chat. But again, I might miss your chat, so feel free if I miss it to shout out, or I will pause once in a while to check the chat. Okay, so I wanted to start off by just talking about some common risk factors that we see. And a risk factor is a feature that is often present in somebody who attempts or dies by suicide. And I want to highlight before I tell you these risk factors or these features, that these are really determined by researchers who look at big data sets, right? So we'll look at data sets with thousands of people and see, what are some averages or, what tends to happen among people who attempt or die by suicide, just so we can know what to look out for. But, so I know I have had the experience of, somebody reading off a list of risk factors, and then I start to feel like, oh my gosh, maybe I have some of these things or a loved one has some of these things. It doesn't mean that you're definitely going to do it. It really is just like a probability that makes somebody more likely to die by suicide or attempt suicide. Um, One thing that's not a risk factor that I always want to say, especially when I'm talking with younger people, is that asking about suicide is not a risk factor. So sometimes people will think, well, if I ask or if we talk about suicide, then that might kind of put ideas in people's heads or increase their risk. And there's actually so much research to show that that's not the case. And it's actually a really good idea to ask a question, because we want to get that information out there. If somebody is thinking about suicide, we want to know. So, if you've ever had that thought, please know it's not going to increase risk. You should definitely ask the question. But here are some risk factors, some common risk factors for suicide. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are kind of the main ones, is if somebody has had a previous suicide attempt, if they've ever done anything with the intent of ending their life, then they are more likely to do so again, and more likely to die the next time that they do it. If they are engaging in non-suicidal self-injury or self-harm, if they're doing any of the cutting or burning or scratching or hitting their head or something like that, that they're more likely to be at risk for suicide. If somebody's engaging in what we call substance use, so if they're using drugs or using a lot of alcohol, it really is just an issue that it kind of lowers people's inhibitions and makes them more impulsive, and puts them at risk for doing something impulsive like attempting suicide. If somebody has chronic illness or if they're in a lot of pain, they're more likely to die by suicide. If somebody is in the LGBTQ plus community, they're at greater risk for suicide. And if somebody has had a recent suicide death in their social network, that's called suicide contagion. And it just means that, if somebody in your network dies by suicide, then you're at greater risk. You can imagine that, you're stressed out, you're really sad. And now, this death has happened, and it's just more likely to affect you. So we have to be really thoughtful if there's been a death about people in the network. There's less research about protective factors or, features that are present in people that makes them less likely to die by suicide, but there is some. And you'll hear these kind of themes popping up throughout the lecture today, which is if there is really good social support. So if you have, really good connections to your family, if you have great friends, if you're engaged in, sports or religious activities or, clubs or something like that, can be a really helpful, productive factor. If somebody has really positive experiences with mental health treatment, if they have a therapist that they like, or if they have, just been to support groups or engaged with mental health in some way and had a positive experience, and if they're in a neighborhood that makes them feel safe. if they don't have to deal with violence in their community. These are things that can protect people from suicide. So, I've been talking a lot. I'm happy to pause for any questions, but I also want to hear from you all. We've been looking at some statistics, looking at lots of numbers and graphs, but I'm curious when you think about, youth of color and the fact that they're, experiencing increases in suicide, why do you think that youth of color are experiencing more suicide? I'd love for you to drop some ideas in the chat below. Again, if I can find the chat, because Zoom is not my friend today. But what are some ideas that are coming up for you about why you think that youth of color are experiencing more suicide? There are no silly answers. I would love to hear your thoughts. Yeah, cultural differences, discouraged to sharing emotions. Yeah, lack of community, especially if you're, in an area that's already impoverished. Yeah, treatments aren't really necessarily developed for people of color. High expectations for sure. Yeah, lack of access to resources, stigma, that's a big one. Yeah, people not reaching out for help. Any others? Well, these are really, really great ideas. And a lot of you should be researchers because these are things that it took researchers, a minute to really understand. And clinicians, even today still kind of struggle to understand some of these issues. So I'm glad that you're aware of them. Oh, we got one more. Yeah, higher chances of being exposed to negative social experiences like bullying, hate crimes, systematic discrimination, things like that. That's a really big one. So those are a lot of the ideas or the themes that we see when we look at why youth of color are at a bigger risk. So before I um, talk about, specific groups or things like that, I just want to highlight that when we're talking about youth of color, we're talking about a huge group of people that are so diverse, right? And so it's really hard to make general statements because we're talking about people who are so different. When we talk about youth who are at risk for suicide, we're talking about ages 10 to 24. That's a huge age range, right? If you think about when you were 10, and those of you who are, in your 20s, you're very different than when you were 10. So there's that. And then there's also just the fact that youth of color are so different. They have so many different cultural backgrounds and immigration experiences, acculturation experiences. And so it's just really hard to make general statements, even though we are seeing these kind of increases across the board. So I'm going to be talking about some of the general themes that we see when talking about youth of color. And I really encourage you to kind of think about, if you are somebody who identifies as a person of color or a more minoritized identity, how does that sit with you and your experience? Or, if you aren't, luckily, New Jersey is one of the most diverse states in the country. And so you probably have friends who do, and just kind of think about the experiences that you're kind of seeing in your life and how that matches up with the things that you see. So one of the major themes that we see when we look at suicide among youth of color is access to mental health treatment. And this is where we're going to be spending most of the time today. It's something I'm really passionate about. And it's when we look at, suicide, that's where we kind of see the biggest disparities that is contributing to suicide among youth of color. So first, I'm going to show you this bar graph, which is not even looking at suicide. We're looking here at national data of adolescents who met criteria for depression. Called a bunch of adolescents back in the days when you could call people and they'd pick up their phones. This kind of old data. And they did like an interview with them to see if they would meet what we would call clinical criteria for depression. So these are youth who they probably should be in treatment, right? So if you are meeting diagnostic criteria for depression, you probably need mental health treatment. Um, and then they asked, are you in treatment right now, or have you been in treatment in the past year? So if we look across the board, this is broken down into different racial and ethnic groups. That the norm is actually that most teenagers, most adolescents who have mental health issues are not receiving treatment. So if you look at this first graph here, this is white youth, that 58.7%, that blue section of the graph is the proportion of the youth who are not receiving treatment. So these are white youth who have depression who are not receiving treatment, and that's 58%. So more than half of the white youth who had depression were not receiving treatment. And that's actually the case if you look across different racial and ethnic groups, if you look across different ages, that most people who don't have mental health, who have mental health issues, are not receiving treatment. But if you look at the other racial groups, looking at Black, Hispanic, and Asian, you can see that that blue portion is getting larger and larger and larger. So for Black youth who had depression, it's 66%. For Hispanic youth, it's 67%. For Asian youth, it's almost 60 or 77%. So it's like access to treatment or being in treatment is an issue across the board, but when we're looking at youth of color, we can see it's more pronounced. And then when we look at suicide, um, it's still the case. And that's especially concerning because you would hope, right, that if somebody is really struggling with thoughts of suicide, that they would say, now's the time, right? Now's the time. I really need to get some help. But that's not what we're seeing. So we can see this graph here, again, kind of old data, but it is national data where somebody went and asked a bunch of youth, have you thought about suicide in the past year? And in fact, this is actually asking, have you attempted suicide in the past year? Have you done something with the intention of ending your life? And then they also asked, have you received any mental health treatment in the past year? And you can see down here, people who have not had a suicide attempt, that is about like 20 to 23% of people who had service in the past year. But if you look at people who have had attempt, again, you would hope that more of these people have had treatment because they really have struggled in the past year. If we look at white youth, it's this kind of long dashed line, it goes up to 47%. So almost half of those youth had received mental health. But the lines don't really change when we look at Black youth. So it's this kind of straight, solid line. And then the smaller dashes is the Hispanic youth. It goes up a little bit, but not very much. So that's really concerning. And this was, kind of my experience as I was going through my training and being really, interested in working with youth of color, is that I would see that there were, not a lot of youth of color who were receiving treatment, unless even when there was an issue of suicide. So far, we've been talking a lot about what I call butts and seats, right? So we want people to get treatment. If I ask, somebody who is struggling with suicide and I say, have you had treatment? And they say yes, that's good. I want that. But that can't be the end of the conversation, right? Because it's not just a matter of having your butt in the seat. It's also a matter of engaging and getting the most out of treatment. So you can see here this picture of this gentleman here. He is what I would call a butt in a seat. He is sitting there, he's with the therapist, he is talking to her, but does it seem like he is engaged by his body language? Not so much, right? So he's kind of frowning a little bit, his arms are crossed. So he looks like he's maybe not having a good time. Now, treatment is not always fun and games. For those of you who have had therapy, sometimes it's not fun. Sometimes they ask you to do difficult things. That generally people would have positive attitudes about the treatment that they're receiving because then they're more likely to come back and get the most out of treatment. And so something that I look at a lot in my work is kind of expanding the notion of to not just include, is this person sitting down? Because in that way, this person would count. But I want to make sure that especially youth of color that works for them, that they believe in, and that we can work with them to make sure that they can have positive attitudes about treatment when it's available to them. So I like to break down treatment engagement into behaviors. So, the things that you can kind of measure and see that show that somebody is engaged with treatment. And then also attitudes, so things that you can't necessarily see, but that are going to affect how people are working in treatment. So what are some types of engagement that we would want to look at? So, and behaviors, these would be things like, have they attended a good number of sessions? Have they done what we call premature termination, which is when somebody ends treatment before the therapist says that they should be ending, right? So the therapist would say, like, no, I really think you need a little bit more help. And they're like, no, 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 I'm out of here. That's what we would call premature termination. If they pursue referrals, so, let's say that they went to an emergency room or a hospital and somebody gave them referrals to say, like, you need some more work after you leave here. Do they follow through with that? Do they complete their homework if their therapist gives them homework? Are they on time for sessions? These are behaviors that we would want to see of somebody who is really engaged in treatment, especially if somebody is struggling with suicide, right? Because that's when we really need to be kind of intensively focusing on their mental health. But there's also attitudes, and this is where we see a lot of disparities among youth of color. We also see disparities among behaviors, but when we look at the attitudes, I think that's where we see some really interesting things. Is we see more mistrust of mental health providers. We see more stigma. Somebody mentioned stigma before about not feeling like they should be talking about mental health or feeling bad about having mental health issues, even just like a basic understanding of treatment and like what is mental health treatment, what are some of the things that you need to know, that you need to do, and also just believing in treatment, believing that this is something that's going to help you and is going to be a positive experience for you. So again, I like to kind of expand the idea of treatment, especially when we're thinking about people who are at risk for suicide. And I also want to think a little bit more about these kind of phases of engagement. So, if anybody has, been in therapy, you know that it's actually quite a process to get into treatment. And I like to break it down into these different phases to think about like where there might be some barriers. So here's a tip, please, pay attention because I'm going to be asking you about these later. But there's treatment norms, which are the things that your community, your family, your teachers, your friends have taught you about treatment. And it wouldn't be necessarily like, a teacher in front of the classroom teaching. It's more just kind of things that you hear, things that they say, that you kind of internalize and think about yourself. So, are you in a community where people are saying, oh, like treatment is great, you should go get therapy? Or are you in a community where they say, maybe you shouldn't get therapy, maybe you should try something else first, or, therapists are all, hack jobs or things like that. Those are norms that you learn from other people. And then there's your kind of own internal thoughts about your need for treatment, right? So everybody has to have their own kind of internal mental journey about deciding I actually need some help, that I'm struggling with something and I need to reach out for help in some way. And people have their own kind of variations in that. And then there's also just like access to care and what you turn to when you need any help or healing, right? So some people will turn to like a mental health professional. Other people would turn to, people in their community, mentors, clergy, things like that. So we all have kind of different people who we're taught to turn to. And then there's like that step of actually like seeking help, making the call, doing the research, which is actually really, really hard for people who are having mental health difficulties, right? So I think we all have had that experience of when we're feeling really down, or really overwhelmed, and somebody says, like, what can I do to help? And you're just like, I don't know, I don't know what I need help with, or like, I actually do know what I need, but I just can't do it right now. So that's really, really difficult. And then finally, there's just like that participation with a therapist. Let's say you went through all these things, you were able But therapy is kind of weird. It's an uncomfortable new relationship. You have to keep trying at it. Sometimes, it's a little hard. So you can see here that there are a lot of things that go into getting into treatment. So I want to pause here, oops, and see if anybody has any questions before we get into our group activity. Anybody have any questions about things that I have said so far? I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment so I can see you all. Any questions, any thoughts before we do a little group activity? Everything made perfect sense. That's so great. Awesome. Okay. So what we're gonna do, and I think if I'm a co-host, I can maybe do this, is I'm gonna share my screen again so you can see the prompt. So we're gonna get into some small groups. I'm thinking, let's see how many people are in here. Maybe groups of like 3 or 4. And just discuss each of these, phases of engagement and any barriers that you could see to engaging in mental health treatment for people who are at risk for suicide. Where do you think that people might really struggle to engage fully in treatment, whether it's, having negative attitudes or negative behaviors or, struggling with these kind of phases of engagement. So I'm going to break you into groups, talk about it. And then when you come back, I want to hear some of the ideas that you came up with. So let's do, oh, maybe I can't do a breakout room.
Oh, I can, no worries. Like
Okay,
maybe we
cool.
could do like how many people? Whatever. Maybe we could do like 5.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Lynette. I feel like they
No
always know what
problem.
breakout rooms are, and I can never find them when I need them.
I know.
Oh, thank you, Ashley. Thank you for putting the prompt in the chat. All right, so I'll give you like I'll say 5 minutes and we'll come back and I want to hear what you said and then we can maybe pause for a break because it's been about an hour. So bye-bye, everybody.
um cult- cultural stigmas or whatever like that get passed down through the generations, and it could be like intentional, but it could also be just unintentional, that it's just mental health and talking about your emotions is just not um like prevalent in the culture or like in your family or whatever. And so that just kind of creates a negative stigma, not because they want to create a negative stigma, but because your parents and their parents were kind of like raised in a way that like, oh, we just don't talk about emotion. So then obviously that just passes down to the generations, and so then you don't talk about it. So it's like an unintentional like different cultures, religions, families, whatever, unintentionally just stigmatize mental health because it's just not brought up. It's not
Yeah,
because they hate it, but
yeah, of course. Like it's not an intentional thing. It's just like that's just not what we do.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Thank you. Any other ideas?
My group kind of talked about like similar things. We kind of talked a little bit more about how people who don't really reach out and like seek help when they're dealing with mental health struggles, it's a lot of times because they don't want to like burden the people that are around them. And they feel like if they're sharing their emotions or sharing their problems, they're going to be putting like an unnecessary amount of pressure on other people and kind of giving them problems that they don't really need to necessarily deal with. So, yeah, that's something that we talked about.
Yeah, for sure. Like especially if, the family or the community is already stressed out about other things. It's like, why would I share my things and add to that burden for sure.
Yeah.
Any others?
I was a
Us.
part of the same group as
Oh, go
Papa.
ahead.
Sorry, but one thing that we did talk about also was, um, it was not just like cultural, but there's also kind of like a lack of culturally competent like resources, because if you are a minority, sometimes like the things that contribute or like maybe even cause your mental health issues, like if the person that you're confiding in doesn't really understand, I don't think you can get like the best level of support that you need. And I also think like especially if you are a youth coming from a household that doesn't necessarily believe in mental health or like mental health resources, it can be really difficult for you already being a minor trying to find resources, and especially resources that are accessible to you.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Like if you're reaching out for help and then you have to like explain to your provider basic things about your family or about your culture, like that just it just makes it really hard to get the most out of your care. And most mental health providers are white. So that makes it hard. That's a really good one. Isaac, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, we also talked a lot about that, and I think even when there are therapists who have cultural competency training, there's still kind of a barrier between experiences. But one thing that we were also talking about was the way different cultures present their symptoms can often be very different. And for example, in some cases, instead of saying that people are sad or depressed, they might report more physical symptoms like your stomach hurting or your head hurting. So I think the way that we conceptualize and experience mental health can also be very different. And even though we have standards like the DSM-5 and whatnot, it can be a challenge to kind of match those two together.
Yeah, for sure. Like if you're seeking help and then like the group that you're in, like people don't kind of experience their mental health in the same way that you do, or like you don't realize that that is actually like a mental health thing. For sure. That's a big one. All right, I want to hear maybe one more and then we can go on a like a 5 minute break.
Michael talked about almost like what everybody else also talked about, like cultural expectations and whatnot. But we also talked about how like being a minor and reaching out and also like being afraid that they'll reach out to their parents and like not keep the stuff that they talked about like within themselves, and the fear of just letting out, especially like if your parents or like your family like don't really believe in that stuff, like it could be like a risk, like getting all of that out.
Hmm.
But no, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because there's always like, oh, sorry, okay, I thought I heard something else. There's always that like, potential that a therapist or a counselor will reach out to your parent or send you to the hospital or something. And it's like, I don't know if I want to be doing that. I just wanted to talk about it with somebody. Especially if your family is not down with mental health. That's really tough. Well, these are some really great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing and for thinking hard and like really engaging with this activity. That makes me really happy. Let's take like a little 5 minute break. Where is my clock, first of all? Let me just like my old school clock. Okay, so it is 11:10. If we can come back at 11:15, then we can continue the talk. See you all later.
Sounds good. See you all soon.
My notes. There we go. Okay, so I promise this is going to be the most jargony slide that we will get to today. And hopefully you've already seen some of this before, because you do, public health stuff here. Um, but I wanted to talk about levels of care and levels of intervention, when we're working with somebody who is at risk for suicide. So this pyramid is, levels of intervention. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary. And so at the bottom, primary is interventions that kind of target everybody. And the idea of these interventions is to identify people who are at risk for suicide to make sure that they can get up to the second level, to the secondary level. So these are interventions like universal screening or social media campaigns, things that everybody sees, hopefully everybody has access to, and that will hopefully get people to get access to resources and services if they need them. So universal screening is, you have probably, if you went to, your doctor's office, your pediatrician's office, or maybe in school, somebody asked you, or maybe there was like a prompt or like a survey that you filled out, that asked, have you had thoughts of hurting yourself, killing yourself, thoughts of suicide, something along those lines. And the goal is that if you were struggling with these thoughts, if you're struggling with thoughts of suicide or thinking about suicide, that you would answer yes to that question. And then they could help you get the help that you need, and identify you, because they're asking everybody. Or, if there's social media campaigns or some other type of public health campaign that you would see, like maybe, when you were riding a train or something, you saw an advertisement, so that you knew that if you were struggling with thoughts of suicide, then you could reach out for help, maybe call 988 or something like that, and get the services that you need. So that's a primary intervention. The next level up is secondary intervention. And so these are interventions that we give to people who have been identified at risk with the hope that it won't get worse, right? That it won't have to go to the tertiary level of intervention, which is really intensive. So these are things like school-based mental health services, which are becoming a lot more common, or outpatient therapy. So, the hope is, somebody's kind of struggling maybe with some kind of lower level thoughts of suicide. They get identified, they go and see a therapist, maybe in their school where it's easier for them to get access to him, or outpatient therapy at like a clinician's office, and they get some help and then they get a lot better. But if that doesn't work, if somebody is, still really struggling, or they're identified, at this primary level and things are really severe, then they move on to the tertiary level, which is hospitalization. That is where put somebody in a psychiatric inpatient unit, where they have, 24-hour watch, and they have lots of providers and lots of resources and lots of services, to help people to get to a level where they can be safe. And then hopefully they will step down to a secondary care and get better. So I've worked at all three of these levels as a clinician. And something that I have noticed, especially among youth of color, but it really among a lot of youth, is that their mental health issues are not addressed or identified at these lower levels. And so they get worse until they have to be addressed at a higher level. And I want us to just kind of stop and think about what it would be like to, go straight from having like no care. Maybe you shared with a school counselor that you were kind of struggling with thoughts of suicide, and then bam, next thing you know, you're in an emergency room. You are at a psychiatric inpatient hospital, which, again, I worked at a hospital. They're incredible people who work there. They really care about the work that they do and about their patients. And hospitals can be kind of a scary place. That, they take away your shoelaces, they take away your phone, you're away from home, you're with other people who have a lot of different, kind of mental health issues. And sometimes that's exactly where somebody needs to be, right? If they're at risk for suicide. And it can have some negative consequences. So, just think about, and I'll be asking you in a little bit to talk about this some more, what that might be like. Um, and if you have any thoughts, you can drop them in the chat below. I'm just going to pause here and ask for any questions. Again, I cannot. There's the chat. There we go. Um, what do we have any questions about levels of care, or any thoughts that people might have about, how these levels of care maybe aren't working for youth of color? Any thoughts about that? Feel free to unmute or put in the chat below. I see people typing, so I'm giving some time to let them get their thoughts together, type it out.
Someone sent me something in the chat. I'll just copy and paste it into the main room.
Oh, okay. Oh, good question. Would outpatient PHP, which stands for partial hospitalization program, or IOP, which is an intensive outpatient program, both go in secondary? That is a really great question. It's kind of in between. So it would technically be secondary. So these are programs that are more intensive than outpatient therapy. So outpatient therapy is like every week, every other week, for like an hour. Whereas a partial hospitalization program or an IOP would be, maybe every day, maybe 3 times a day, 3 times a week, where you would have group therapy and a psychiatrist and, a little bit more intensive, but it's not as intensive as being at a hospital. So that's actually sometimes a really great kind of middle ground for people who are really struggling with thoughts of suicide, but they don't obviously want to go to a hospital, that they can go to an IOP or a PHP. And I've actually worked at an IOP. I think it's a really lovely intervention. And Gabby said screenings may not be directed towards minorities or factor in their unique backgrounds, which is a really great point, Gabby. There's actually been research to show that people of color are less likely to actually say yes on those universal screenings than white people, for a number of reasons, right? And a main one is that, they might be more willing, more likely to do something that's called like socially desirable. They want to kind of please the person who is asking the question. They don't want to cause a big, kerfuffle. They don't want to cause a big mess. Or maybe they're scared about what would happen. They don't necessarily trust the people who are asking the question. So we actually know that those screenings are not as effective for people with minoritized backgrounds. Any other thoughts about this levels of care? Let me actually go back. Ooh, can I go back? Go back for me. No? Okay. What's this one? I think my cute like question slide is making it hard. Okay, there we go. Any other questions about these like levels of care or thoughts about how it might be hard for youth of color to be served well by these levels of care? One thing that I would see a lot as a clinician is that, people would kind of be bounced up to hospitalization, to tertiary care. Um, and then the goal would be, yes, I understand this was kind of a scary, intense experience, having to go to a hospital. But now you're leaving. We're so happy that you're doing much better. Please go to this therapist. We're giving you a referral. Call this person when you leave the hospital, and go get some therapy. And they don't make the call for a number of reasons, whether they're, scared about finances or they, heard bad things about that clinic, or it's not easy to get to, or, their family is not really down with mental health, that like they just wouldn't kind of drop down to that secondary level. Um, any other thoughts before we move on? Or questions? These are really helpful questions. All right. Well, no more questions. We'll keep it moving. There we go. This is a model that for those of you who have had a psychology class or like a sociology class, you may have seen before. This is called Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. I changed some of the terms in case, people who are purists, because honestly, they're just jargony and I always forget what some of these like the systems are. So I made it easier. So the idea, it's actually a really easy idea, is that we are not in a vacuum, right? That we are influenced by many, many, many things when we make our decisions or when we develop as youth. I'm not youth anymore, but for you. So the idea is that there's the person, the individual who's in the middle, the kind of unique attributes of who they are in the middle. And that interacts with the relationships, the people in their family, their friends, the people at their school, the people who they interact with every single day. All those relationships are going to impact and kind of interact with the person, who they are, right? And then we zoom out even more, there's these institutions or the communities that you're a part of. So that would be like school, work, clubs, sports, if you're part of any kind of religious community or any other, online community, things like that. These are all institutions, communities that impact you, and the decisions that you make and the way that you think about yourself. And then we zoom out even more, and then there's the culture that you live in, and things that are going on politically, things that are going on in current events, cultural ideas, and things like that. So these are all things that impact the way that we make decisions about our care, the way that we think about our mental health, they affect, development of mental health disorders, things like that, right? So I want to pause again and do a little group activity where we're going to break out into some small groups. It can be the same ones, it could be different ones, whatever is easiest for breakout rooms. And I want us to think about these levels of influence, these systems that we're all focusing in, and also those kind of levels of care, levels of intervention. And think about when we're looking at youth of color, what would be some barriers at these like different levels of systems or levels of intervention that would make it hard for youth of color to get mental health treatment at each level? So we're going to break out into breakout rooms again. If
You're fine. I think I'm gonna make new ones.
okay,
Um, and I'll do the same thing like last time, like 5 different groups.
awesome, thank you.
Yay. Ashley, do you mind putting the question in the chat again for
Yes,
everybody?
I will put the question. Oh, unless somebody else has that, I can put the question in the chat.
Or Linda, if you want to, either way.
Just a level of like discussion that was happening. It was very high level things that you would see in graduate school. So I would love to hear what are some sorry, the pizza on the head got me. I wasn't expecting that. I love it. I'm here for it. Um, so I would love to hear from people what were some ideas that were coming up about barriers at each of these levels, whether it was the Bronfenbrenner, levels or the, pyramid, tertiary, secondary care. What are some things that you could see that might be barriers for youth of color?
Well, we were kind of talking about mental health stereotypes at all levels for our group, and with the pyramid, and how there's like kind of a stereotype that if you need hospitalization for mental health, you think like it's like, oh, that you must be crazy. Like that's a very big stereotype. And I know with like personal experience and like my friends and just like in general, people don't want to seek help or engage with their treatment if they because these stereotypes, because they're worried that they're going to be viewed as crazy, or they're like in their heads, well, I'm not crazy, so why do I need it? When the truth is, you're not crazy if for needing mental health treatment, because these are conditions, not like craziness.
Yeah, for sure. Like, what's going to happen when somebody comes back to school after being discharged from the hospital? There's going to be like all the rumors and all that kind of stuff. So that's, yeah, definitely a huge stereotype and stigma that like makes people not want to go, even if they need it. Vaishnavi, I saw you were talking, but I couldn't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So, you kind of came in the middle of our conversation too, so you heard some of this, but we were talking mostly about like the financial aspect. So, especially for the higher levels of care, therapy is expensive. Being hospitalized is expensive, and sometimes your insurance can't cover, or they choose not to cover it. So that can create a huge barrier from getting care because you won't be able to afford it, and it would also make you feel like you're putting the burden on your loved ones or those who are supporting you.
Yeah, for sure. Like it is not free to go to the hospital. And, depending on what your insurance is, if you even have insurance, or if it's like changed recently, that might affect like financially, it might be a huge burden on you and your family to go to the hospital or even to get therapy. Um, yeah. Any others? Maybe one more. All right. Well, then let's keep it moving because we do have a lot to get to. Um, second, where is it? Zoom? Zoom has disappeared again. Oh, I see some. Yeah. You don't, oh, yeah, exactly. You don't owe anybody an explanation. And we would actually, when I worked at the hospital, we would like work that through with people, like as they're being discharged, if they were worried about, um, you know, the rumors, we would talk about like some options that people had. Um, okay, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to move a little bit faster, and I think I'm going to have to cut one of the group discussions, even though they're so fruitful, because we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have time at the end for questions. So just really quickly, we've been talking a lot about risk factors for treatment or things that make it harder for people to get treatment. But I always like to, end on a bit of an encouraging note that there are some things that make it easier for people to get treatment if they need it. That if their family has positive beliefs about treatment, they have positive beliefs about treatment, if they've had positive previous experiences with treatment, if they have easy access to treatment, and hospitals are really thinking hard about how they can make treatment more accessible to people who need it. And a big one is actually if they have access to school-based services, which is becoming a lot more common, that people will have like a therapist or a clinic that's actually based in the school, so that they can have it like just really easily accessible. So these are some things that can make it easier for people to get access to the treatment that they need. All right. I'm just gonna pause really quickly if anybody has any questions for the larger group. Oh, I see something in the chat. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that this is like personal health care, that you don't have to answer any questions. Any other questions that people had? Okay, well, let's move on and talk about some other risk factors, or some other things that kind of uniquely affect youth of color. We're going to talk about racial stress, which are, any stressful experiences that are due to one's identity. I always like to just pause before we talk about things like racial stress and say, we often hear about these things. And for those of us who have a minoritized identity, it can sometimes um, perpetuate this notion that like it is bad or it is hard to be, a person of color, to have a marginalized identity. And that's not always the case, right? Like it's not all like stress and doom and gloom. There's actually beautiful things about being marginalized. And it can also bring some stress. And so it's important to acknowledge that. Okay. So one thing is acculturation. So acculturation is the process of adapting to a different culture. And so, those of us who come from families of immigrants, we're very aware of this. Something that people talk about a lot. That, maybe a family member or you move from a different country in a different culture and, have to talk about how things are so different here. Um, but one thing to note is that this has happened over generations, right? It's not just the process of somebody who moved, but it actually happens, for their kids and their kids' kids and things like that. For example, my dad moved, and so I saw him, he had been here for a long time before he had me and my brothers, but he had his own process. Being in a different culture, and that affected me and the way that I think about this culture, and kind of holding some of the Ghanaian culture and also being American. And then I have my own two kids, And they kind of have their own process about kind of relating to culture. So this happens over generations. So I just want to pause and have been here for a while. That, what is your own story of acculturation? And just to kind of stop and think about how that has impacted you and the way that you think about mental health, the way you think about mental health care, and how that might impact your community. And some things that we know about acculturation when it comes to suicide and mental health is that that process of acculturation, especially if somebody has moved recently to a new culture, is that it can just be stressful. It can be really hard. You have to maybe learn a new language or learn a new way of doing things, new systems. And that can be really, really stressful. And that can be, a cause for mental concerns and a risk for suicide. And then there's also the fact that there are, these gaps between different generations about how they relate to cultures, right? So, if you are a child of an immigrant, then, you might be very well aware of the fact that like you both might have different ways of relating to this culture that we're in, different ways of thinking about mental health and mental health care. That can also be a stressor. And then, of course, acculturation can affect access to care, right? So if somebody has recently moved, they might not have access to mental health care that they need. They might not have the finances, or may not be comfortable getting access to care. So these are all things that can impact access to care and suicide. And then there's discrimination as well. So we're all aware of discrimination. We've been talking about it already. We know that it's stressful to be treated differently, to be treated negatively because of your background. And this is something that actually has been consistently, like it's not even a question anymore, it's consistently linked to poor mental health. Across the board, it's also consistently linked to poor physical health in your body. It's been directly linked to suicide, that people who experience more discrimination are more likely to have thoughts of suicide and die by suicide. And something that we've already talked about as a group is that it can affect access to care. That if you've experienced suicide or if it's systemic suicide, then it's going to be harder to find care and to trust a therapist as well. And some work that I've actually done is that being exposed to discrimination online via social media is also directly linked to thoughts of suicide. And it's not just like if somebody's directly discriminating against you, like if somebody's like in your DMs or something, but also if you are just like indirectly seeing discrimination. So if you're like watching videos of people being targeted or seeing things in the comments, that also is linked to suicide. So these are things that are uniquely impacting youth of color and making them more at risk for suicide. I'm gonna unfortunately have to skip this group activity, but feel free to drop in the chat. We can talk about it later. Or you can maybe talk about it in the chat about your own racial group and how acculturation or discrimination might be influencing risk for suicide among your own individual group. So as you write that, I'm gonna really quickly go through family and community context factors, and then we're gonna stop and I want to hear thoughts that you have, questions that you have, even if it's about, me as a clinical psychologist or things like that. I want to hear it all. So, when we talk about youth of color, we need to be thinking about family and community because it's a really big part of everybody's life, especially if you are from a minoritized identity. So first talking about family, youth of color tend to come from families where cohesion of the family or the kind of collective family is really, really valued. And that can be a strength, right? Like we talked before about how being connected to community, having positive community is actually a protective factor for suicide. But it can also be a stressor that if there's issues within your family and your expectation is to be really a part of the family, that family is everything and it's really important, or if there's something going on in the community, then that is also going to cause more stress. And also, if there's this value of cohesion and getting everything in the family, then there also might be issues with asking for help from outside of the family, right? So if somebody mental health care, then somebody in their family might be saying like, oh, you shouldn't be talking about, these things outside of the family. Why can't your family help you with that? Or like you should be going to, a religious like clergy or something like that instead of going to a mental health professional. And so that can make things harder. And then thinking outside of the family, again, we talked about how neighborhood violence can also be, or neighborhood safety can be a protective factor. On the other hand, if there's violence in the community, if it's not safe for you to be in the community, that's also a risk factor for suicide. That things aren't safe, that, death is kind of on the mind. Maybe people are just not feeling like, they're in an environment where it's worth living and they're more at risk for suicide. So even though there are some beautiful things about being a person of color, about being from a minoritized community, there can also be some unique stressors and things that, clinicians may not be aware of. So I want to end by, talking about some of the encouraging work that people are doing to decrease the suicide risk among youth of color and really focusing on specific communities. So here's some interventions that people have been doing is first it's just increasing access to universal screening and really thinking about like how can we ask these questions in a way that people will be more likely to answer them, and are there like other places that we need to be asking these questions, right? So maybe you wouldn't want to answer that question if it was at a hospital or a pediatrician, but you might be more willing to answer it if it was like, at a church or at a mosque or at a community center or something like that. Also increasing access to school-based mental health. It's really, really helpful, making sure that people can access mental health services when they're at school. It just makes it easier. Also doing more work to incorporate families into treatment. Often treatment is just kind of between a therapist and like the individual. But if we incorporate families more into treatment, then we can really target those kind of family context things that are happening and make treatment a little bit more inclusive of youth of color. There's also been more work on mental health outreach and really making sure that, clinicians and clinics are in the community so that people can see them and see that these are, cool people, they're chill, like, it's easy to talk to them and just really reduces that mistrust and the stigma. And also there's been a lot of work, and this is some work that I've been doing, is really educating clinicians about these unique factors that are important for youth of color, things like acculturation and discrimination and family factors and community factors, to make sure that when somebody does make that decision to see a therapist, that the therapist is going to be really helpful and understanding of the things that they go through. So I'm going to end here. I would love to, spend some time answering any questions. I'm also going to drop just really quickly. Oh, hold on. I've lost you guys. Okay, stop share. There we go. Just really quickly, I have a poster for a study that one of my colleagues is running that I would love for people who are under 18 to, take a look at the poster and see if you want to participate. So it's about community violence and gun violence on social media, how you're experiencing that. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. But I would love to hear, oh wait, maybe I can't put it in the chat. Or maybe I'll just send it to you, Lynette, if you wouldn't mind distributing it.
Yeah, no worries. You can also you can send it to me now and then I'll put it in the chat for everyone.
Yeah, I can do that. But I would love to know, we've talked about a lot of things. I saw some lively discussions in the breakout groups. What are some questions that people have about suicide among youth of color, or just about, being a clinical psychologist in general? I'm happy to answer them. And just making sure that poster gets to Lynette while you think about questions that you might have. No questions. Wow, I'm surprised. Oh yeah. Sorry.
I can ask one. What's your favorite part of your job as a clinical psychologist?
Oh, that's a really good question. My favorite part of my job. I think right now my favorite part of my job is actually teaching. I teach, I call them baby psychologists, people who want to be psychologists. And it's really fun to see, how things have changed since I was in school, that it's like way more diverse and people are asking questions that like people weren't really asking back when I was being trained. And also it means that like I get to introduce ideas and make sure people are um, just training in a way that makes sure that they can treat all youth. So that's really fun and exciting. Ooh, that's a good question, Anushka. What does research as a clinical psychologist look like? It can look like a lot of things. So it can be like, for this study that we're recruiting for, that it's like a lot of surveys. So this is actually going to be like surveys that they like ping to your phone and ask you a couple times a day, like what's going on? How are you feeling? So it can be that, or a study that I'm working on actually with Isaac. Is we're going into a therapy program, and helping them to figure out ways that they can make their program more inclusive of youth of color. We're actually going to be running like focus groups and asking former patients, what was it like as a person of color in this program and how can we make this program better? And introducing some potential modifications. It can also mean like developing new treatments or new interventions and testing them out. So those are a lot of things that I do. I really see myself as somebody who is trying to develop resources for clinicians and also potential patients to make their mental health better. So there's a lot of things that we can do, and it's kind of cool. I really like research. It's frustrating sometimes, and it's really fun. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. This was really, really fun. I hope you learned something and had a good time as well. Feel free to, email me. I can share my email with Lynette if you have any other questions. And yeah, thank you so much for a great 2 hours.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. Um, snaps, snaps. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, Jam had a quick question in the chat.
I think Jen was I've actually heard of this show that there is like a Japanese show that I have
What's
this
the show? What the heck?
called Oshin or something. Which is funny because I have a friend whose name is Oshin and she was named after the show. So anyway, that's not, but yeah. Thank
This
you.
is so cute. Oh my God, I love it.